This is a video about Thomas Malthus. In this video, we'll cover Malthus's differential theory of rent, which is simply just that the rent produced on ownership of a land, rent would be paid generally to landowners, could be calculated as the difference in productivity between the most productive land and the least productive land, or in other words, the difference in productivity between the land the landowner owns and the worst plot of land. And we'll also talk about Malthus's population principle, which is essentially that resource growth cannot outpace population forever. So eventually, without some preventative checks, population will grow too large and we'll run out of resources. And we'll talk a little bit about Malthus's theory of gluts. So we'll start here with gluts because I don't have a slide just for that. But what is a glut? A glut simply refers to any situation in which more product is supplied on the market than is demanded. All right, remember, we haven't really formalized the mathematical equations for like a supply curve and demand curve yet, but we do have a general conception that there are people who sell stuff and that's supply, and there's people who buy stuff, that's demand. All right, so anytime you have way more supplied in the market than is demanded, this is what Malthus calls a glut. In the modern literature, we would probably think of this as more, we might call it excess supply or a surplus. All right, so gluts can happen for a number of reasons. They can happen because too much is produced that wasn't demanded. They could happen because people are unwilling or unable to purchase. Traditionally, in the Malthusian sense, a glut would happen because the population can't sustain itself. We don't have enough resources to feed everybody. And so the population starts decreasing. We don't have enough people or income to buy the stuff that has been produced. It could refer to situations in which people don't want to buy the stuff that was produced, but usually traditionally, because again, we have this working class that's just making subsistence. Traditionally, a glut would happen because people are too poor, wages are too low, can't afford subsistence, can't really afford anything else, so they can't afford the products that are on the market, and we have all of this unsold product built. Right, so gluts are kind of important through Malthus and Ricardo because they ultimately, the two authors that we'll see in this video and the next video, have a few debates about whether technology or machinery is good for workers or bad for workers, and this definition of a glut comes up a bit. All right, so a glut just means consumption can't keep up with production forever. For whatever reason, we have a greater supply than we have demand of the product. And usually in Malthus, it's because people are very poor. All right, so let's look at Malthus's theory of rent, which essentially just says that rent is paid to landowners, and we can calculate economic rent paid to each landowner based on the productivity of land. So imagine we have sort of a continuum of units of land. So here's our first unit of land, here's our second unit of land, here's our third unit of land. We've got some sort of subsistence wage or overall cost of working the land. And because this land is on a continuum from most productive to least productive, we can say here this first plot of land produces the most total produce, and this one produces the next most, followed by this one. Right, so what's going on here? We can calculate rent just as the difference between the productivity on one plot of land compared to the productivity on the least productive land. So where's the least productive land we have? It's this one right here. And here's our total produce or total productivity off of this land, level K. So let's look at our first two plots of land. Our first plot of land here has this much total produce. And compare that to the productivity on the lowest land is here. So this is rent for the first plot of land. Look at the second plot of land. That one is this productive. Compare it to the productivity on the worst plot of land, which is here. So there's some economic rents here, which ultimately go to landowners. Right. We want to distinguish profit from rent. Rent is generally paid to landowners, whereas in these models, in Malthus and Ricardo, we generally have three groups of people. So there's landowners who own land, and they would get the rents from the land. There's workers, and we know what the workers do. They work and they earn subsistence. And we finally have one more group of people, which would generally be called kind of like capitalists or machinists. And it's a little bit of a different sense than you would see capitalist used in other writings. But here, capitalist just means people who build machines or people who innovate or people who are able to make the land more productive and so on. Right, Malthus thinks that we need those people, we need capitalists, and so there is some profit justified, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Profit is still not quite formally defined. We don't have these equations, total revenue, total cost, and so on. So what is profit in these models? Ricardo basically builds a model off of Malthus's work or similar to Malthus's work, which shows profits in there. All right, so we'll talk more about profits, but generally speaking, we just need to know that Malthus believes that profits are justified because we need people to have incentives to produce more, bring more land into use. All right, the problem here is that ultimately we get to this point, we're working this third unit of land. There's no more rent to be extracted. We can't really drive costs lower because we're already assuming that workers earn subsistence, and that's most of the costs here. So at this point, economic growth essentially stops, right? So comparing Malthus to Adam Smith on economic growth, Adam Smith, of course, thought that the division of labor and specialization was going to be good for us. We produce more, we're able to consume more, have more kids, and so on. Malthus is sort of like a yeah, but doesn't deny the gains that are had when we produce more, consume more. However, there is some limit to it based on the resources we have. We can't grow forever. Eventually, all this rent and profit is going to be squeezed down, and we're operating here at cost or zero profit. So past this point, there's no economic incentive to produce more. Growth stops. Furthermore, in Malthus, we see that because we're earning subsistence here, you just kind of think of this K as a subsistence wage. Is the working class better off when we grow economically and call more land into use and produce more stuff? No, they just earn subsistence. Okay, so in Adam Smith, economic growth, definitely good. In Malthus, we wouldn't necessarily say that economic growth is bad. It just has limitations. Right, what else are those limitations on growth, or a little bit more specifically about those limitations? Malthus's population principle. So it's pretty straightforward, and it's actually, if you've heard of economics, referred to as the dismal science. This is kind of where that moniker comes from. So Malthus believes that, first of all, people need to eat food, and our need for food is not decreasing. Malthus also says that the passion between sexes is not waning, and this leads to reproduction. Basically, if you give people money as wages grow, what are people going to use that money on? Having and feeding more kids. So population grows, and so on, right? So population is going to increase geometrically, resources are fixed or they grow arithmetically. So the hypothesis here is, if left unchecked, the rate of population growth will soon exceed the growth rate of resource use. And Malthus thinks that ultimately this results in gluts or excess production. Malthus thinks we'll have produced all this stuff, especially industrial goods, but ultimately we run out of food. When we run out of food, people starve, and there's no one left to buy the products that we've produced and are out on the market. So in order to avoid this, Malthus thinks that we need to have, as a society, these preventative checks, which are social measures to reduce birth rates, general awareness about population, sex education, other things like this. If not, we're going to see what Malthus calls positive checks on population, which I guess you could think of preventative checks as being sort of planned social measures to reduce birth rates. And these positive checks would be unplanned measures like high death rate, poverty, misery, general suffering that cause people to have less kids because they can't afford it. Right, so there is a general overview of Malthus. The main thing that he's known for really is this population principle, but we also see this differential theory of rent that the main use of that will be kind of carrying forward into Ricardo and his corn model, and just seeing kind of the development of some economic principles that we carry forward into the modern literature.